the talk this evening. So Emily Alfred is the waste campaigner for the Toronto Environmental Alliance. She's a self-proclaimed waste nerd and our favorite trash talker. And she'll be talking all about plastics, what's going on at multiple levels of government, and how we can create system-level change. So yeah, as I mentioned, Emily will speak, and then there'll be lots of question and answer time.
Is this a good volume? Can you all hear me in the back? I have a soft voice, so if I ever get really quiet, please just go like this and I'll try to talk a little bit louder. But yeah, thanks Jolene. I'm really happy to see so many people out tonight. This is really exciting. And as Jolene said, this is the first time we've ever done this kind of talk about plastics. So we were really overwhelmed and thrilled by the big response we got. And we know that plastics is something that we can all relate to and we're all worried about. So I hope you guys learn a lot. I'll try not to get too much into the details because as Jolene said, I'm a waste nerd. I get really, really excited and I can talk for hours. But I will limit myself to 1 hour tonight, possibly less. So first, I'll just tell you a little bit about the Toronto Environmental Alliance. So maybe I'll just take a quick show of hands. How many people here know about tea? Awesome. Okay, that's great. So I don't need to explain too much, but I'll just say, we've been doing this for 30 years now. We work on environmental issues at the city level and at the provincial level, and we are focused on a green, healthy, and equitable city with economic activity that sustains our environment. We're an alliance. We work with a lot of community groups, labor groups, other environmental groups, and we do a lot of advocacy. We're not a charity because we advocate for policies we believe in, and we don't want to be restricted by charitable regulations at the federal level. We work on a lot of things. We've had a long history working on toxics, climate change, green space and green belt, air quality, and of course waste. So we work for zero waste. That's what we're aiming for. And the way that we do that is as experts, as watchdogs, as researchers, and by engaging the community. So, for example, I was a member of the City of Toronto stakeholder group that helped develop a long-term waste strategy for the city. I've also been a participant in a lot of provincial stakeholder groups to help develop the provincial waste strategy and to consult on those things. After developing those policies and helping consult on those policies with those government bodies, I then played the role of the watchdog. So, this morning I was at the Public Works Committee hearing what city staff were saying about plastics and our blue bin. I also work with other environmental NGOs from across Canada and across Ontario to submit comments to the province when the province proposes new policy and regulation. In terms of research, one really exciting project we're doing right now is I'm doing a research project with University of Toronto, and we are doing interventions in high-rise buildings across Toronto to see how we can get those buildings to zero waste. Using that research and that information, it will help me advocate for better policy at the city and at the provincial level. And then we do this. We want to get people involved in this kind of policy decision. We want to get more people aware of how much power they have. So that's kind of a nutshell of how I work on zero waste. So tonight, we're going to talk about plastics and our waste system. I'll give you a bit of an overview. We'll talk about some of the policy solutions. And I'm going to do a little bit of myth busting and some traps to avoid. Some really easy traps that are there that we can fall into. And I'll tell you a little bit about me. This slide's fine. It's a nice picture. Actually, it's a terrible picture. It's nice colors, but it's terrible content. So I'll tell you a little bit about me, and this is about my work as a waste campaigner. So I love working at TEA. I love that we do advocacy and we do education. And part of that is my own personal journey to become an environmentalist and an activist for TEA. I spent a long time thinking about the environment, feeling really guilty and really stressed about environmental issues. Things like climate change, things like plastics in our oceans are totally overwhelming and just emotionally draining. And I spent a number of years doing what I could to buy nothing, buy only secondhand clothes, refuse to buy anything that's in plastic, do whatever I could. I lived in South Australia for a while, and I remember we were driving to plastics recyclers in the other end of the state to bring our plastics to recycle. Like, we were doing whatever we could. And it was really, really, it felt empowering sometimes, but at a certain point I realized it was sucking up so much of my energy and so much of my time, and I was full of guilt, and I was frustrated and angry and full of shaming other people for what they were doing. And it was just so much work. And I thought, you know what? There's got to be a better way to do this. So now I work at T, and one way I like to sort of encapsulate what I do is instead of convincing 3 million Torontonians to stop using plastic bags, I can convince 44 councillors to ban plastic bags. And that's a much, much faster way to get things done. And we really have the power to do that. And it's good for us to remember that we're not consumers, we're citizens, and we need to take that power back. So that's what I love about my job at T. That's the story. So, plastics is what brought us here. I could take a show of hands about who's concerned about plastics, but I'm not going to bother. We're hearing about plastics everywhere. They're in every part of our planet, unfortunately, is now infected with plastics. Plastics have only really existed for the last 60 or 70 years, if you think about it. Right? It's a new material. Before that, humans got along just fine with fabric, wood, metal, and glass. And production of plastic around the world has absolutely skyrocketed. It keeps getting more and more. And I saw some great statistics last year in a BBC report. They said that since the beginning of plastic production, 8.3 billion tons of plastics have been created on Earth. Of that, 75% are already finished in terms of their usefulness. They are either in a landfill or they're in our environment. 75% of them are out of use. 10% of that has been recycled, 10% incinerated, and most of them are in the environment. So it's billions of tons of plastic, and we're still making more. So we can go next. A lot of plastics can be recycled, but a lot of them can't. There's a lot of sad plastic statistics. There's so many, we hear about them. I'm not going to give you too many because, again, a lot of downer kind of statistics just makes us all feel really crappy. So, plastic bottles, though, are one thing. This is #1 plastic, probably, PET, very recyclable, but a little stat that you probably don't know. In Ontario, only 30% of plastics that are recyclable are actually recycled in our blue box. We have a lot of plastics that are just not getting recycled, even though we have a very good recycling system. So, there's a lot of problems here. Next slide. So this slide is just sort of a cue for me to talk about some of the plastics in the news. I guess, anybody want to say some of the news they've heard about plastics recently in the media, mainstream?
China isn't accepting the unclean recyclables that they used to.
Did everyone hear that? That China has shut its doors to really dirty plastics? Anything else people are hearing in the news?
Toronto's paying $9 million extra this year as a result of that? Is that what Will said today?
Yes, the City of Toronto have estimated that it may cost $9 million extra to process our recyclables this year because of that change in market conditions.
Did you do that research? I have a question. Some stores, when you buy mushrooms, have a
maybe if we can just hold the questions. Yes, black plastics is a great one. We can put some questions on paper and we'll ask them later. But you're right, black plastics is actually something that's been in the news. I'll talk about that in a minute.
No, I was just going to say they did research on some bottled water and well-known brands, and they got like 90 particulates of plastic in them.
Microplastics in our drinking water. There's also microplastics in our soil. Do you have another news?
Yeah, so there's a whale that was found with 29 kilograms of plastic. It's really in Murcia, in Spain.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone heard that? A whale that washed up on the beach and they found 29 kilos of plastic in its stomach. Okay, one more of a headline. And then
A positive one. Scotland is going to ban straws because of the
Awesome.
stop sucking.
great. That's awesome. There is some other good news, and I'll mention some of it later. But yeah, there's. I'll give some quick positive ones now because I think we all need it.
Yeah.
Starting July 1st, microbeads are banned in cosmetic products in Canada. So it's a federal regulation. Starting July 1st, also, I can't remember which one came first. Victoria has banned plastic bags, and Montreal has also banned plastic bags. That's 2 plastic bag bans this year. So those are some great things. Also, the UK has just announced, research came out like yesterday saying that their plastic bag tax has reduced plastic bag use by thousands of percentage. Sorry, that's not an actual a lot. It worked a lot. So anyway, so that's just some things in the news, and I'll talk about those. I'll touch on a lot of them. So some of the reason why plastics are so difficult is that they're complicated. So there's very easy to recycle plastics and very typical plastics, and we think of plastic water bottle and some basic things. But plastic resins are very complicated, and there are different types of plastic resins. And the fact is that the products and the packaging that we see every day, and that our consumer products come in, are changing way faster than our recycling systems can handle. So at the top here, I have some stand-up pouches. Has anyone? I buy things in the stand-up pouches. They're everywhere right now. They're fantastic for marketing, and that is how they are promoted to companies, because they stand up on the shelf. So you imagine going into a store, like frozen food used to be like frozen peas would be laying down in the bag. Now they're standing up and looking at you. That's worth a lot of money for advertisers. They pay for where they can be on the shelf in a grocery store. So those stand-up pouches get the product into your shopping cart sooner, but they can't be recycled because there's different layers of resin, and the zip at the top is made of a different type of plastic again. So that's the kind of packaging innovation that's great for companies, but is not great for the environment or for recyclables. Straws and other convenience products. We can go to the next slide. Plastic bags, coffee cups. We've probably all heard about these things and how they're not necessarily recyclable. They're convenient. They help us buy things. They make our lives seem easier, and companies can sell stuff to us. When they make it easy, they want to get us out of the store, and they very actively lobby against any regulations to restrict these. I want to say a little bit about compostable plastics. It's kind of one of the traps that it's very easy to fall into. Compostable plastics are not necessarily better at all. Compostable plastics can be sort of a greenwashing. Companies can use it to sell you the same amount of stuff, the same amount of products and disposable things, but now it's just compostable, so you feel a little bit better. The fact is that to make compostable plastics, it actually takes more energy and more resources to make a compostable plastic resin than to make a regular petroleum plastic resin. Neither is good, and we can't just substitute one disposable for another. It also doesn't break down in most composting systems, and it can cause problems in recycling systems. Compostable plastics are also difficult because recycling facilities can't always tell the difference between compostable plastic and regular plastic, so it can actually lower the quality of regular plastics in a recycling facility. Black plastics, everyone hates them. They're so confusing. Why do we have them? There is no answer. Honestly, they're not recyclable in Toronto. We've probably all heard this in the news recently. The fact is that Toronto actually has a really sophisticated recycling system. So I just want to say that first. We're really lucky. We have one of the most comprehensive waste and recycling systems in North America. And sometimes we forget how lucky we are because we have a big city with a lot of money and it can afford to do these kinds of things, but a lot of other cities can't. So Toronto has a super high-tech recycling facility. We send it all north of the city. It's called Canada Fibers. They use conveyor belts, puffs of air, magnets, lasers, optical sorters, all this crazy stuff, and then people working hard doing this stuff. And those lasers can't read black plastic because it's an optical sorter and it shoots a ray of light at the plastic to tell what kind of resin it is, and black absorbs light. So there's no reflection back, so they can't tell, is this a number 1 black, number 2 black, number 3 black? They can't tell what kind of plastic it is. This is not just a Toronto problem, this is a universal problem. If you Google black plastics, whatever, there are like people around the world who are like, oh, how do we solve this problem? It's so complicated. And I think it's, what questions? So the thing is that really, why are companies still using black plastics? And why can't we just change the color to another color? I think it's because black is cheap, makes things look good. So, you know, there are these little frustrations with our waste system. And black plastic is a great example, and that's actually going to be my segue into talking about our waste system. So, the way our waste system works, you may not know this. I don't know, how many people know that there are many levels of government involved in our waste system? It's a complicated system. A lot of people think about the city and think that the city manages waste and regulates all of our waste. But the fact is, so the next slide, the city manages residential waste and residential blue box. And the city can use some types of bylaws and restrictions to restrict litter and some types of materials. But the province is the one who decides who pays for waste, what counts as waste, who's allowed to move it, and where it goes. The province also regulates who pays for waste and who's responsible. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. That's extended producer responsibility. And we have some of that in Ontario right now, and we're definitely on the cusp of getting more. But the important thing that a lot of people don't realize is because cities are responsible for picking up waste and recycling, each city in Ontario can have different recycling rules. And that makes it really confusing if you work in one city and live in another. The city also is only responsible for residential recycling. So every shopping mall, every office has different recycling rules because they just pay for a waste company to pick up their stuff, and that waste company can tell them what they can recycle. So the problem is that we have a very fragmented system, and it's very confusing to the average person. So I'll describe a little bit about how Toronto's system works. The City of Toronto picks up the recycling at the curb or from many high-rise buildings. Under provincial law, multi-residential buildings are actually treated more like commercial buildings, so they actually are allowed to choose whether they get city waste collection or whether they hire a private company. And then we don't necessarily know where that waste goes or who's recycling it or what recycling rules they're following, because that's entirely a private business transaction. So in Toronto, we're lucky because the City of Toronto provides waste services to about 80% of businesses or buildings, high-rise buildings, that's apartments and condos. But in some cities, the high-rises have no service from the city. After the city picks up recycling, they then take it to a city-owned transfer facility or transfer station. So that means whether it is privatized collectors who are picking up west of Yonge, or whether it's city unionized workers picking up the waste, it all goes to the same transfer station, and then that gets into the city recycling facility, which is a contracted facility. Just north of the city, it actually manages the waste for about a number of municipalities in the GTA. So this is the big recycling facility. They're actually called material recovery facilities, or MRFs. It's a bit of a weird word. Think of Smurfs. These are just absolute amazing feats of technology. You've got piles of mixed recyclables, and like I said, you've got puffs of air and lasers and weights and these crazy machines that just sort of bounce the plastics up so that some things go up and some things go down. And then you have people working in vacuums that they throw the plastic bags into. It's kind of amazing that we put this much work into dealing with our waste. You just think, surely there's got to be a better way to deal with this stuff, but it's pretty remarkable. So as I said, plastics and recycling and what is recyclable is decided by each municipality. So each municipality has to work out what they can collect from their residents, what they can actually sort based on the technology of the MRF they're using, and what they can market. So what plastics or what paper or what types of metal can they actually sell to the market to get a little bit of money back. As I said, non-residential buildings have different rules. Packaging is changing way faster than what cities can handle. Companies are pumping millions of dollars into coming up with new packages and new ways to sell products to you, and municipalities just don't have the resources to keep up with that. And to be honest, recycling is expensive. It costs more to recycle something than it does to send it to a landfill. That's just the fact. So when a municipality is stuck with a budget decision, it's kind of hard to say, well, let's recycle this additional thing that's going to cost us a lot more money. I was at the Public Works Committee meeting this morning, and they were talking about the increased cost for the blue bin because of changes in the market and how the city now has to have lower contamination levels in our recycling bins. And a number of councillors on that committee said, what does this mean for our rates? How much more are people going to have to pay for their waste bins? They weren't necessarily thinking about the environmental impact, they were thinking about how much this is going to cost people. So that's how a lot of people think about waste, and that's the reality we have to deal with. So, on to some positive ideas, solutions to plastic pollution. So, there are a lot of, I just want to say before I get into some of the policy solutions, I do want to acknowledge, like I said before, there is a real value in individuals taking action and living according to our values and making ethical decisions about what we buy and reducing waste in our day-to-day life. But what we at T are doing and what I'm really focused on is the way that we can change the system and the way that we can work together and spend our energy together to change the system rather than looking at individual actions. I also want to say that I do acknowledge that when it comes to waste, we've got to reduce and reuse first, and recycling is only the last step in that sort of 3 R's paradigm. But we also want to look at recycling realistically and understand what role it can play as a solution. So the policy solutions I'll talk about are sort of, we can kind of categorize them in 3 sort of ways. Zero waste and circular economy, which is about a policy approach and a concept. Extended producer responsibility, which is a policy tool. And then just regular regulations and restrictions. So first, zero waste. Anyone here familiar with the term zero waste? It's kind of a new term, so it's a new and old term. And zero waste is really an approach to materials and resources that works to eliminate all forms of waste. So we can think about this as reducing, reusing, recycling, and then redesigning or rethinking everything until one day there's no waste at all. Moving my hands on. So zero waste, a lot of people think about it in terms, or in recent years a lot of people are talking about the zero waste lifestyle as individuals making choices to avoid consumer packaging and consumer products. But zero waste is also a more systems and a policy approach. So some of the language around zero waste actually emerged from international movements and also movements in other places, sort of couched in terms of environmental justice. So communities that were faced with new landfills or incinerators in their neighborhoods got up and said, we don't want this here, this isn't fair. And they thought, wait a minute, if it's not here, where's it going to be? So ethically, they said, you know what, we've got to say zero waste. If we don't want a landfill in our backyard, we can't, in good conscience say that it should go in someone else's backyard. So it gets people stopping and rethinking the system altogether rather than just saying, not here. Zero waste is also about the circular economy. Has anyone heard this term? Okay, good. Yeah, circular economy, it's kind of a new term. It's sort of a new buzzword. I don't want to say buzzword implying that it doesn't mean anything. It actually is a meaningful concept when it's used appropriately. So I think circular economy is a cool idea. So basically right now we have a linear economy. We take natural resources out of the earth, petroleum, we're doing mining, we're getting water, logging, all those things to get materials. We're manufacturing them into new things. People buy it, use it, and then it gets dumped. It either gets burned or sent to a landfill. And that's a linear economy, and that's what happens to most of the resources we consume right now. A circular economy is about saying, listen, let's just cut off this entire bottom half. Like, let's just get rid of that stuff. We've got enough petroleum out of the earth already, we've got enough wood, we've got enough aluminum. Let's just keep reusing the materials we've already got out of the earth. Let's make things more durable. Let's reuse them. Let's repair them. Let's find other ways to recover and repurpose those resources so that we're eliminating the most destructive part of our economy. And that's another point I want to make, is that when we think about waste, we often think about the impact of not disposing of something properly. But it's actually really important to know that most of the environmental impact of what we consume happened way upstream before it even got into our hands. And it's the embodied energy and the embodied pollution from that extraction of those natural resources and all the effort that went into making that product. So a circular economy is really about removing the destructive elements of our economy and finding ways to get more circular. It also provides good green jobs. We know that reducing, reusing, and recycling and composting creates 10 times more jobs than disposal. Any form of disposal, an incinerator or in a landfill. So that's a good thing for people who are more concerned about the economic side of things. When it comes to plastics, as I said, this really means we eliminate disposable, single-use products. They just don't fit in a circular economy. If they're wasteful, it's not worth making them. We have more repair and repurposing. We think about innovative, reusable packaging, closed-loop packaging, where you have something that maybe people mail back. There's some cool innovations happening there. Recycling that is high value. A lot of plastic recycling, some things like metal, infinitely recyclable. Glass, infinitely recyclable. You can just keep recycling that stuff into something new and it's fantastic. Plastic, most of the time, each time you recycle, it downgrades in quality. A few more times. So some plastics you can only recycle them 2 or 3 times until they're just sort of like a stop on the way to the landfill. Plastics are not that great for recycling, so we need to look at how we can shift that to make closed-loop, high-value recycling. So a plastic bottle being recycled into another plastic bottle, not being recycled into a block, I don't know, being recycled into a park bench, something like that, or just kind of a lump of plastic. So to build a circular economy, a lot of people use something called extended producer responsibility. Because right now the problem with our linear, unsustainable economy is that companies that take those resources out of the earth and that don't have to think about it once it's off the shelf in the store, they are externalizing the environmental impact of their decisions. The cost, the environmental and the social cost, is just not something they even have to consider. So those costs are externalized. So the idea of extended producer responsibility is that it's a policy approach where we say the producer, manufacturer, designer, or brand owner, as it's sometimes called, sometimes they're called stewards. So the producer's responsibility for a product extends beyond just creating it and selling it. Their responsibility extends to the full life cycle of what they sell. So I love this idea because in some ways it sounds totally radical. It sounds like a crazy hippie idea, like, hey man, let's just make everybody responsible for the stuff they do. And like people are going to say, oh, that's a bit too much, you know what? There's got to be a reason we don't do that. It's totally happening. It's happening all over the world. It's happening in Ontario. It is not that out there at all. It's just a matter of getting it going sooner. So I'll give some examples of how it's happening right here in Ontario. Beer store. I enjoy beer. I'll be honest. So the beer store is a great example. Since the 1920s, the beer store has had a deposit return program. It's one of the longest running, most extensive deposit return programs there is, especially in North America. They have been selling beer in refillable bottles. So these brown bottles are called I think they're called the industry standard bottle or the standard brown bottle or something. I can't remember what it's called, but basically a bunch of the major breweries agreed we'll all use the same bottle, same style, and when someone brings their beer back to the beer store, those bottles get washed and refilled up to 15 times. Way more efficient than breaking the glass down, sending it to a processor and making a whole new bottle. Just refill it. Makes a lot of sense. So the beer store system, in their 2017 report, they said they got 96% of beer bottles that were refillable were returned to their store. 96%. That's almost all of them. I think the rest probably just broke, or they're sitting in someone's garage waiting until next year. 96% is a huge number. And that's the kind of number that we should be aiming for. In terms of non-refillable containers, they got almost 90%. So that's like the cans, or like the weird big mini kegs they have now. And then the beer store's model was successful. So the LCBO's deposit return program now, which covers all alcohol containers, including wine in a box, plastic containers, cans, everything. All of those have a deposit on them, and they have about an 80% return rate. Compare this to the blue box, which has about a 60% recycling rate for drink containers. Deposit return works. The other thing about a deposit system is it takes that waste and that material entirely out of the tax system and the municipal system. So the City of Toronto is no longer dealing with broken glass beer bottles in the bottom of their recycling bin. The City of Toronto is not trying to figure out how to sort those beer bottles and market them and find someone to buy it. It's a consumer relationship between the beer store and their beer drinkers. And it's not externalized to the government or to the rest of society. So I think that's a great example of an innovative way to collect materials. Tires. Has anyone heard about Ontario's tire recycling program? I feel like I'm a big advertiser right now. It's pretty cool. I know tires are not something people get really excited about, but I think this is a really great example of a policy success. So tires in Ontario have, I believe, a 95% recycling rate. Again, really, really high numbers. That's amazing. 95%. And some of the background context for this is that a number of years ago, before my time at Tea, but there were other Tea campaigners who told me about this work, the province had tire yards and big garbage yards all over the place. Piles of tires. Some of you may remember the Hagersville tire fire. Huge, big piles of petroleum in tire form sitting there just waiting to be ignited and causing crazy pollution. And everyone said, oh my God, what are we going to do about the tires? And some people came in and said, let's burn them in an incinerator, we'll make some energy. Let's burn them in a cement kiln. And then a group of environmentalists, including Tea campaigners, said, wait a minute, we should be recycling tires. Don't just burn them, that's destruction, and that's a big waste of energy. It doesn't create energy, it wastes it. So the province passed a new regulation saying all tires must be recycled. Manufacturers of tires need to make sure that they recycle, or that the tires that they sell get recycled. So now Ontario has one of the highest tire recycling rates in North America. There are at least 2 tire recyclers in the Toronto city limits making new tires, making things like rubber roof shingles, making AstroTurf, like underlay for carpets, a whole bunch of things. So a policy change made those markets happen. And those companies that make tires are the best ones to decide, what can we do with this material? When they were told they had to do it, they found a way. Now they're doing great. So I think sometimes people get scared to do a regulation or a policy saying it's going to hurt business. What are they going to do? But businesses are really smart. They can figure out how to get materials from the other side of the planet and sell it to you when you don't even need it. They can figure out how to recycle this. So the way extended producer responsibility, or EPR as it's called, works is it gives companies a direct incentive to reduce their packaging or eliminate it altogether, to choose easy to recycle material. If they have to pay the cost of recycling, suddenly they're going to say, oh, whoa, let's think about what we're making this out of, what's actively worth, what's easy to recycle and what's costly to recycle. It also gives companies an incentive to innovate in terms of collection and recycling, or to invest in new recycling technology. So the beer store is an example of a new way to collect materials. A deposit system is a very easy way to get good, high-quality recyclables. Also, if companies have to pay for their recycling and they have to prove that they got their materials recovered and recycled, they're going to be a lot more interested in investing in new technology to try to get that sorted. Rather than just saying, hey, municipalities, you need to invest in this, they have to do it. So the other great news is, well, we have some EPR in Ontario already with the beer store and with the tires. We also have a new act called the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. It's 2016. It's not totally new. I still think of it as new because it was really exciting when it passed. Has anyone here heard of it? Or the Waste Free Ontario Act, as it's sometimes called. Ontario had another act for a long time. They kept planning to rewrite it. It took so long. Everyone argued. Companies said, no, we don't want new EPR rules. Took forever, so the fact that this finally got passed was very, very exciting. We were there at all these meetings talking about how we need good new EPR regulations. Other environmental groups were there. And just a little note about the advocacy and the watchdog work we do. When I was at meetings at the Ministry of the Environment talking about EPR regulations and what environmental concerns we have, or the public interest and how the public understands these things. There were times where I would be either the only or one of the only environmentalists in the room. So Ministry of the environmental policy, but what are we going to do to protect the environment? A room full of 65 people, and there's 2 environmentalists in the room and a whole lot of industry. A lot of representatives and paid lobbyists. It's their job to do it, but just, I don't think people are realizing how much that's actually happening. And so it's really important to have voices like environmental groups at that table saying, remember the environment. Let's make sure we actually put the environment in the first line of this policy. So there's a few examples of that. But with the Waste Free Ontario Act, the Waste Free Ontario Act is sort of like the casual name for it because resource recovery and circular economy doesn't really roll off the tongue well. But this act really sets a framework basically saying that the province can pass EPR regulations for all forms of waste. So tires are one, as I mentioned. There are new regulations in the pipe for e-waste, all forms of electronic waste, and that will actually extend to small appliances as well, not just computers and phones the way it does now, but to other types of electronics. So that's similar to what's going on in BC. Hazardous waste, pharmaceuticals, furniture, textiles, construction waste, this is everything. And so this framework exists, and under this framework, the ministry has to work to create specific regulations for each type of waste. And those regulations sort of outline who's going to pay for it, who they have to report to, and what the consequences are if they don't do it. So this is why we need to make sure those regulations are really strict. They have targets like 95% recycling, because we know it's possible. Even though they might say, 40%, that's really what we should be aiming for. We're going to say, no, we want 95. And real consequences. If they can't meet their targets, they shouldn't be allowed to sell in Ontario. So these are the kinds of things that we're pushing for in these regulations. And I think it's a real opportunity if people know about these types of policy opportunities that we have. So I'll mention the blue box, because this is what relates to plastic the most. So right now, we have sort of what they call a shared responsibility model. I would say it's not really shared fairly at all, but right now, municipalities are required to provide recycling to their residents under provincial regulations. Municipalities design, deliver, and manage blue box recycling programs. They do all the work, and then they report to the province, and companies, producers in Ontario, have to report on how much they sell in Ontario, and then at the end of the year, they get a bill and they cover 50% of municipal costs. So right now, if I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say it costs Toronto $70 million to do recycling, at the end of the year, they might get reimbursed for $35 million. In reality, it's usually less than 50%. With this model, municipalities are really the ones who are still stuck doing all the work. It's really tough. That's why we have one city has one set of rules, another city has another set of rules. Producers feel no pain at all. If their material is not getting recycled well, they're just like, oh, well, I guess I have a smaller bill to pay this year. There's real gaps in the system. So under the new Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act, we are hopefully going to be moving to we are moving to a new system of full EPR where municipalities will just step back and be out of the recycling business entirely. So this means companies will not only be financially responsible, they will be legally responsible. So they will actually be in charge of creating and managing those recycling systems, investing in those recycling sorting technologies, bailing up those materials, and marketing them out to anyone who wants to buy them. So this removes that cost from the taxpayer, it removes the cost from municipal waste fees, and it gives companies an incentive to do all those things we talked about earlier. And actually, go back one slide just for 1 second. Thanks, Tisha. Just a word on this. I don't know if I had it in a later point in the slide, but right now, the Blue Box is probably one of the most complicated programs to transition to this new full EPR model because you have municipalities and contracts and all these assets sitting away. We were getting there, and there were meetings between the producers and municipalities to make this happen, and then everything sort of stalled and fell apart. I would say it's because the producers weren't interested in moving forward quickly, because right now they only have to pay half. So why would they hurry to pay the full amount? And now that we have a provincial election, things are stalled again. So this is just, we're getting there, but I think we need to up the pressure a bit to say that we want this policy to pass faster. So, EPR is one tool. Telling companies they have to pay for their materials is one way to do it, but honestly, it's not the whole solution. Companies can use EPR, they can spend all the money they want recycling their things, but sometimes we just don't want it. Sometimes it's just the environmental impact of creating that product or having it in our environment is just too much. So that's why we need to look at bans, fees, and just laws to just outlaw things entirely. So I'll give you some great examples of what is already happening. I already mentioned the federal ban on microbeads. That's a good one. Next slide. Gross picture, sorry. This is a picture to talk about the San Francisco cigarette litter fee. Has anyone heard of that? Okay. Yes. So, this started in 2009. The city of San Francisco started by charging 30 cents on every single pack of cigarettes sold to help cover their cost for cleaning up litter. Of cigarette-based litter. So that's cigarette butts, the plastic wrapper, the little foil paper, the cardboard box. Now, each year they've increased it based on how much they think it's costing them to collect that litter, and it is now up to 75 cents per pack. They estimate that they make about $9 million per year from this cigarette tax. And that cigarette litter makes about 25% of the litter that San Francisco is finding on their beaches, and their parks, and on their streets. And the city spends about $25 million per year on litter cleanup. So this $9 million helps, but it's still not covering all of it. But it's a really cool tool to say, if you smoke cigarettes and drop them on the ground, that's going to cover our municipal costs. Other systems have been considered, like deposits on the filters. I know Toronto is actually looking at what the city can do in Toronto about cigarette litter. And the San Francisco one came up, and that's when I was like, oh my god, that's such a cool. So, another example, plastic bag bans. As I mentioned, Montreal has one now. Victoria's one is starting very soon. More than 40 countries around the world already have full bans on single-use plastic bags. This is a very widespread thing. People know that plastic bags end up in animals' stomachs. They clog sewers and drains. They are just not necessary. Like I said, people got along for many centuries, thousands of years without plastic bags to get their goods home. So we can find other ways to do it. Yeah, I already talked about the 1,000% decrease in UK estimates for their plastic bags. So in the first 6 months of the plastic bag fee in the UK, they estimated that bag use dropped from 7 billion per year to 1 billion. In the first 6 months. Like, that's huge. Toronto had a plastic bag ban, or a plastic bag fee first. And during that time, some estimates said plastic bags use decreased by 50 to 80%. And then the plastic bag ban vote, craziness happened. I can explain all of that policy weirdness to you guys sometime if you want, but not now, because that would take a really long time. And the city actually found that plastic bag use went up after the plastic bag fee was cancelled. So we know that they do work. So Toronto, single-use plastic bans. I think it's something we really should be pushing for. I think we can push for single-use plastic bans at the provincial level, but we're in Toronto, 44 councillors, they don't have parties, so it's a lot easier to talk to them and get them really thinking about local issues. So we can start at the city level. In the past, we had a plastic bag fee. The city also doesn't sell bottled water on city property where there's a drinking fountain available, because they say Toronto tap water is great, people shouldn't need to drink it in a plastic bottle. Also, coffee cups. Does anyone here know that the city in the past tried to restrict coffee cups? So this happened in 2008 or 9 when the city was doing its plastic bag research. They also looked at restricting or banning the use of takeout containers and coffee cups that weren't compatible with the city's recycling system. What happened was the companies that sell coffee, some of the big names that we know, got really freaked out about that, had a whole bunch of lawyers show up at the city and talk about why this should not be happening, and the city backed off. So this is the way that lobbyists really do affect our policy and our environment. I'll bring another example later. So the good news, this is just a positive thing. As I mentioned, I was at the Public Works Committee meeting this morning talking about the increase in cost for Toronto to deal with our recyclables because of these market changes. And a councillor, the chair of the committee, Jerry Robinson, put forward a motion to ask staff to look into what the city can do to reduce or eliminate the use of single-use plastics in Toronto at the city level. And they're going to be reporting back in July this year. So I think that's awesome. Totally exciting. We're going to see what this report actually says, because the city does have some limited power, but it's great that the city's looking into it. The same motion also said, what can the city do to stop companies that say their product is recyclable in Toronto when it isn't? Because that is a serious problem. The next agenda item was actually about coffee pods, and the two deputants to the committee, like the two groups of people that got up to speak at the committee, were two different coffee pod companies, each one explaining why their pod should be accepted in the city's recycling or compost bin. Even though the city has already spent an entire year consulting with these groups and doing lots of research with them, they still got up to say, you should accept our product in your bin. And the city said, we don't. And one of the companies said, well, in 2 weeks we're launching our advertising campaign telling people how our pod is recyclable. And the city's like, we just told you it's not recyclable. So it's going to be interesting. It's like, why are companies allowed to do that? And it's because labeling is regulated at a different level of the city's recycling bin. Okay, so I've talked a lot about these policy solutions. Now I'm talking about the traps to avoid. These are the things that can really suck us into thinking we've got a solution, but beware. And I just want to share these tips with you because having spent a lot of time looking at these things, I can see the really seductive solutions. So the first one, let me go to the next slide. The idea of consumer solutions, voting with your dollars. The problem with this, people who are rich get more votes. It's not fair. And we live in a democracy. I vote by voting. I don't want to vote with my dollars. If I choose not to buy something, that means my vote doesn't count. So the idea of buying to change society is not enough. Because it just means the people who buy more, they get a better say. And that's not fair. It puts companies off the hook. It gives them another way to just sell stuff to us. And it's all about guilt and shame. It's saying it's your choice. You're the consumer. You guys need to figure this out. And that's just not going to change our society. And when we have values about what's more important to us, we need to work on those, not just by spending money to express our values. Incineration and energy from waste. Again, I could talk for a really long time about this, but I'm going to try to keep it quick. That's why I made it number 2, because if it was number 4, I would talk too long. And incineration and energy from waste, no matter what you call it, is expensive, toxic, and is inefficient. It is one of the most expensive ways to create energy and one of the most expensive ways to deal with waste. It is not a solution. People call it a solution. You'll hear people talk about zero waste to landfill. That's not zero waste. They're just trying to send it somewhere else and trick you. The problem with an incinerator is it is a big machine that costs a lot of money to build. Municipalities sign a contract with someone who will operate that machine for them. And now that machine needs a constant supply of waste. You have to feed the beast. So you don't build it and then stop making waste. When you build an energy facility, you want to keep that going as long as possible. So it works against the idea of decreasing the waste in our society. And it destroys resources. Why would we destroy plastic when we can just recycle it into something new? Like I said, most of the energy impact, or most of the environmental impact of plastics happens way upstream before it even gets to your hand. So I'll give a quick example about incineration. So many examples, but I'll keep it to 2. Honolulu Island, beautiful place. they have a giant incinerator to burn their garbage. They were debating at their council. I did not see the results because I just didn't look into it again. They had an issue before their council just in the last month about whether they should cancel their blue box recycling program because the municipality was running out of garbage to feed the incinerator and they were having to pay a fine to the incinerator operator. So they're like, oh, we should probably stop recycling so much because that's costing a lot of money because all the recycling in Honolulu has to be shipped off the island to China. Can't send it anymore. So their solution was, well, let's burn it. So people say how incineration and energy from waste is not incompatible with zero waste, but it is. We've seen it a lot of times. Another myth that I really want to bust. People talk about Sweden. Sweden has a 99% recycling rate, apparently, and they burn all their garbage. Sweden has a 50% recycling rate. They call incineration recycling there. So they burn about 49% of their garbage. They send a little bit to landfill. Only 50% is recycled. Toronto's recycling rate is 53%. We're doing better than Sweden. We should look to their example. And their own residents and their own citizens have reduced the amount of waste they've created so much that they now have to import garbage from other countries. How great is that, right? You're so efficient at doing this great thing for the environment that now your neighbor gets to dump their garbage in your yard and you have to deal with it? That is not a sustainable system. And most of that garbage they're burning is made of petroleum anyway, so it's toxic. The result, at the end, you get toxic ash. They have to ship that to some poor community that is now suffering beside this toxic hazardous waste. So incineration, it's very seductive. Sometimes it's called gasification, pyrolysis. Lots of fancy names, it's all the same thing. It's destroying a resource. We should be reusing resources. So another trap. Companies love to do voluntary action. They love to greenwash. Who here knows the term greenwashing? Yes, okay. Company painting what they do green, saying, oh, we're doing this amazing environmental stuff, but they're not doing anything. It distracts us from real solutions. Companies use green or voluntary action as an excuse to tell regulators not to regulate them. Like, don't worry, we'll do it. We've got this great, amazing idea. We'll figure it out on our own. Don't regulate us. That's just going to give you a whole enforcement headache. It's not true. A good example for this, I mentioned coffee cups earlier. When those coffee companies were getting really upset with Toronto for suggesting that they would have to change their coffee cup style to fit Toronto's recycling system, they said, don't worry, we'll recycle them in our stores. That's why Starbucks has those recycling bins in their stores. Toronto was one of the first cities in North America to have a recycling bin in a Starbucks. Tim Hortons, little recycling symbol beside it. Did anyone watch that Marketplace episode on CBC? Those coffee cups are not getting recycled. But that was their way of saying, look, we're doing the right thing. It's not working. And there is no follow-up or enforcement. So they just have those bins there. It took a reporter to get people to realize that that was not actually happening. The final trap is weak regulations. I've talked about the amazing power we have in the Ontario's Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act and restrictions and regulations in Toronto. If they're not enforced, nothing happens. So we need to push our governments to pass these regulations, and then we actually need them to enforce them. And this is where groups like T and other environmental groups and just citizens can sit in and pay attention to these things and make sure that those regulations are actually getting enforced and that governments are following through on what they say they will do. So I'm getting to the end. Now I'm getting, sorry, the slides are less, there's a lot less pictures towards the end. That was working for us the last minute. So what we're doing, I've kind of outlined it pretty clearly throughout this presentation, but I'll say it again. We are a watchdog. We're at City Hall, we're at the provincial meetings, we're reading these reports and looking for those code words that might mean energy from waste or incineration. Looking for those code words that might mean the recycling targets are not that meaningful. So by being there and paying attention to those details, we can make sure that those policy changes are meaningful. We're watching at the city with the LTWMS. I'm sure you guys all know what that is. It's long-term waste management strategy. The long-term waste management strategy in the City of Toronto is all about doing these amazing things in Toronto And we are there to make sure the city is moving ahead on that. Because Toronto has been a leader, Toronto can lead the province. This is a little side story. Toronto passed a cosmetics pesticides ban in Toronto before the province did. Toronto is such a big city, we're progressive, we can push for policies and then the province follows because they're not scared. So we should push further. And when people say, that's not city jurisdiction, that's provincial, it's like, we'll figure it out, we'll do it, and we'll do that. At the Ontario level, we're working on the Waste Free Ontario Act, and at the federal government, there's been recent announcements by Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government that they want to make their G7 presidency about international treaties on marine plastics. Is that understandable? Marine plastics are a huge global issue. The G7 group of countries has been working on issues, and now the federal government is saying that they want to lead on it. That's great. Let's call them on it. I'm not sure what they'll do, but we want international treaty on plastics. So we're talking with other environmental groups at the national level and doing what we can to say, you said you want to do this, let's make sure you do it. Oh, this was a mistake slide. Sorry. This is a picture of organics. This is my reminder to tell you guys about how advocacy works. So there are some great examples. This is a good one that's very recent. While the province is creating the Waste Free Ontario Act and the Circular Economy Strategy, looking at all these different types of waste, one type of waste they really looked at is organics. So this is food waste from like residents, high-rise buildings, from businesses all across Ontario. There's a lot of organic waste. It makes up sometimes half of our landfill, I think. It creates a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. The province said, we got to do something about it. So they developed an organic strategy, and that includes actions the government will take, policies for municipalities to follow, and then rules and investment in anaerobic digesters and composters, a whole bunch of stuff. When the province was proposing this, they put it up for public comment on their very clunky, terrible to use website called the Environmental Bill of Rights, the Registry. Terrible website. Has anyone been on that website? You've probably only done it for work because it's just impossible, right? So what we did is, so they put this up there, they wanted public comment, and one of the things that they were saying they wanted to do was just ban the disposal of organics in landfill. Just say, you know what, you can't do it, it's illegal. And of course, industry around the table, those meetings like, ooh, how are you going to enforce that? Who's going to pay? I don't know, guys, what are we going to do about this? So they were, we were thinking, they really need to get some love from the public that says, yes, of course you should do this. Food does not belong in a landfill. Organics do not belong in a landfill. So we made an online form on our website to make it a lot easier than people going to that terrible government website for public comment, and said, tell the government that you support a ban on organics in landfill. Food does not belong in the garbage. We got hundreds of letters in, I think, 24 hours. Probably maybe 400 letters, Julie knows. And I swear, the next meeting I went to at the organic stakeholder meeting, they all turned and said, oh, Emily, thanks for getting all those letters to us. We've never had so many public comments on an issue about waste policy before. And they said it made a difference. Then they had the second round of comments, and we sent in another group of letters and just reminded them, hey, we already got 400 people to comment. And they said that also had an impact. Because then the staff could show politicians and the lobbyists and all the industry people, this is what the public wants. So it gives them that space to say, we're going to push a little bit further. So that's an inspiring advocacy story. So what can you do with tea? Help us bust the myths. Help us shift the conversation about zero waste and how it's about a system. And it's not just about individual consumers. Follow us on Facebook, get our newsletter, learn about what we're doing so that when we give these policy updates, you know when you can jump in and help during these conversations. For example, in July, when that city staff report comes back about single-use plastics, I'm hoping to have a bunch of people in the room to say, yes, we love this, we want this to happen. And then get engaged in the political process. It's a lot easier. Talking to city councilors is really easy. They're in election mode right now. It's a really good time to talk to them. Ask them for a meeting. Say, I want you to do something about plastics. And then when this policy issue comes up at council, they'll say, oh yeah, my residents told me they care about this. So we can help you get engaged in the political process. process.